Welcome to week 6 of Pharmacology for Vocational Nursing 1. We've covered some of this content in the co-requisite course, LVN 121, so the terms and content may seem familiar to you. Today, we're going to apply these concepts to pharmacology in the nursing process. We will have 2 parts to this series, but let's get started with cultural, legal, and ethical considerations. So, when we talk about culture, we know that pharmacodynamics are affected by genetics and drug polymorphisms. We've learned about this in the past couple of weeks. Of course, that is really ethnicity, right? Pharmacogenetics and pharmacogenomics. What exactly, though, does culture have to do with pharmacology and the response to drugs? Well, our culture is the template through which we learn to live our life. And this means that a patient's cultural teaching or upbringing may not place the same value on compliance with therapy. There could be environmental economic conditions that the patient's culture considers of higher value. This includes education level, dietary practices, the overall trust of the system, the medical system in which you're working. So these variations of culture and values can create barriers to adequate health care for the culturally diverse. Barriers are not limited to, but it can include things like cost, when you consider the cost of medication in relation to the family needs, language barriers, and expectations of what medication can and cannot do. So let's talk a minute about assessment. Part of your cultural assessment in relation to medication administration and drug history is to assess language skills. Now, let me caution you and remind you that language is not culture. Not everyone who speaks Spanish is from Spain or Mexico, any more than anyone who is maybe red-haired is from Ireland or black is from Africa, right? We know this and we don't make those mistakes. But as a nurse, we have to be careful not to make those grand assumptions. You cannot equate language or ethnicity with a particular culture in today's world. Facilities have very stringent policies on who can and cannot serve as an interpreter, so we want to make sure that we use those policies and follow those policies, but you need to find out what languages the patient speaks, what they can read, and what languages they understand. Your cultural assessment will also need to include health benefits and practices, past use of medicines, including herbal treatments, folk remedies, home remedies, as well as over-the-counter medications or treatments. As an older nurse, I find it interesting that we're coming back to some of the remedies of the past, which include essential oils and flower essences and some of the alternative therapies. Always remain open and non-judgmental in your data collection. Don't judge or disapprove of the use of amulets or charms or items that are significant to an individual's healthcare practices. As we continue our assessment, we need to gather data on the patient's usual response to illness as an individual, as well as their response within the family unit. Do they typically respond to treatment? Does the patient have any religious practices that are important for us to know? This is not just limited to blood products, but also could be applied to medications in general. Find out what the support the patient has from their cultural community as well as their religious community. Dietary habits are highly cultural and often based on religious beliefs. This is important with regards to medication administration, as there are diets that can affect absorption and metabolism of medications. We know, for example, that high-fat diets can affect the lipophilic medication metabolism, just as malnutrition can affect the pharmacodynamics of any medication. Let's talk for a minute then about drug legislation. Now we're shifting away from cultural assessment, but prior to 1906, there really was no federal legislation regarding medications. The Federal Food and Drug Act established the first parameters that focused on food and drug safety. Then in 1912, the Shirley Amendment to this act created legislation that a medication could not be marketed to tout that it did something that it doesn't do, thereby eliminating fraudulent claims for drug products. The Shirley Amendment always reminds me of Cher. She sang gypsies, tramps, and thieves, right? Cher, Shirley. And in her song, she says Papa would sell a couple bottles of Dr. Good, right? So not much later, in 1914, the Harrison Narcotic Act was enacted, and this legislation was actually a tax act. It regulated and taxed the production, importation, selling, delivery, distribution of the opiates and the coca plants, or the coca plant products. The Harrison Narcotic Acts actually established the legal term narcotic, which is derived from the Greek narkotikon, meaning to make stiff or numb. So then in 1938, the 1906 legislation was revised to include food, drugs, and cosmetics, and it required then that companies include safety data in their FDA review. It wasn't until 1951 that the Durham-Humphrey Amendment to the 1938 Act required that medications be actually labeled with those familiar words that we see on the labels. Caution, federal law prohibits dispensing without a prescription. Then, in 1962, the Kefauver-Harris amendments required that manufacturers prove safety and the efficacy of new drugs. This was in response to medications such as thalidomide, which created devastating birth defects in infants born to mothers who had taken it during pregnancy. In 1970, our Controlled Substance Act was what brought about legislation. This was actually part of the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. And so this act did not just include the narcotics, but all psychoactive drugs, including those that do not have accepted medical uses. This is the legislation that provided for the development of classifications of drugs by their potential for abuse, their potential for addiction, and if the drug has an accepted medical use or not. In 1983, we developed the Orphan Drug Act. This was created to establish and allow research and manufacturing of drugs to treat rare diseases. So when you look at this legislation, consider the timing. You may find it helpful to be able to remember what was happening in the world and the United States at that time. For example, the Controlled Substance Act was signed into law by President Nixon following this Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. This was as a direct response to increased use of drugs in the United States. The Orphan Drug Act was signed into law by President Reagan in response to the need to find cures for rare diseases. Pharmaceutical companies were on board and focusing on common illnesses and diseases because there was a poor economic return on the investment for creating medications that would not serve a large population. So the Orphan Drug Act legislation allowed manufacturers to recoup some of that expense through tax breaks as well as limits of when a drug could be manufactured as a generic drug. Now, we've all been educated on the HIPAA legislation, so I'm not going to belabor that, but remember, medication administration is part of a patient's right to privacy. And then in 2003, we have the Medicare Prescription Drug Improvement and Modernization Act, which established changes to the Medicare system, and you might recognize that as Medicare Part B, which provides a mechanism for prescription drug benefits within the Medicare provisions. As we move along out of legislation, let's talk about new drug development. How they are developed is a very complex process, and the research can take several years. The FDA approval process has 5 steps, but within those steps are some more steps. We know that there is an initial new drug application. There needs to be informed consent. We have this drug preclinical testing, clinical studies, investigational drug studies, and expedited approval. Of course, expedited approval being when we need to have a drug more quickly than we can get it to the market. So preclinical research answers basic questions about the drug's safety. It's not a substitute for studies of the ways the drug will actually interact in the human body. Clinical studies actually include humans. So in phase 1, we usually 20 to 100 healthy volunteers or people with the condition. This study usually lasts several months, and about 70% of the drugs that are studied move to the next phase. Phase 2, the study participants include up to several hundred people with the disease or condition and can last several months to 2 years. About 33% of the drugs that are studied here move on to phase 3. In phase 3, we're looking at 300 to 3,000 volunteers who have the disease or condition, and that study can last 1 to 4 years. Approximately 25 to 30% of the drugs in this phase move on to phase 4. With phase 4, several thousand volunteers who have the disease or condition are studied. Then we move into the marketing of the drug and after these clinical phases, right? Post-marketing and the other steps in the process. So What does all this have to do with us and legal, right? What are our considerations? Well, the state and the federal regulations, the legislations, are important to us. They help us as nurses as we work within our system to administer medications and to teach our patients about education, patients about medications. And so we want to make sure that we're aware of our Nurse Practice Act, that we're following our scope of practice. If we expand our role, we want to make sure we maintain the confines of our role. We want to be sure that we know the educational requirements that we need to in order to practice safely, as well as the standards of care. Minimum safe nursing practice is what's expected of you. And remember, we want to do what a reasonably prudent nurse would do. There are differences between nursing practice and medical practice, and so we have to be very careful that we don't cross those lines. We are nurses. We are not physicians. When we look at these considerations, we can get guidelines from our professional nursing organizations, such as Sigma Theta Tau, which is a organization that works with nursing excellence, and institutional policies and procedures, our state licensing and law. You can also find examples in common law or case law. We will find that some of the legislation is within our HIPAA documents. So we want to use all of these resources to make sure that we remain prudent nurses, that we are safe, that we not engaging in ethical violations, maintain our ethical practices. We've talked about ethics again in LVN 121. We have the American Nurses Association Code of Ethics for Nurses, as well as the International Council of Nurses Code of Ethics. And these are guidelines for us. The expectation is that we will function managing patients' medications and medication administration and helping them to reach the level of wellness that they can within these guidelines. So we are next going to talk about medication errors. That's in chapter 5. We'll have that in another audio. If you have questions or concerns, comments, you all know how to get a hold of me. Email, text, call. I'll see you on Tuesday, and you'll hear from me at about chapter 5 as soon as you click on the link. Take care.